Welcome to the Victoria Rumble Room, the show with the engine that never stops and opinions that really never stop. And I'm Robin Adair, and we have such a show for you. We've just had a federal election, and there's so much to peel through. And speaking about peeling, let's go to appealing, which is how I would describe my co-host, my guest from afar, Jolton John Jurisic, the Croatian sensation. John, we've got so much to talk about. Local stuff around the election, local stuff that isn't really part of the election, but is affected by all these decisions, and so much more.
After that introduction, Robin, I feel like I've become Prime Minister. Well, it's so fun to have a show and that we can yak about these things and yak about things all around the election with the great guests. You know, I've got weird feelings about this. First of all, same result. It just kind of feels like blah. Yet there were some things that happened that are very relevant. You're right, relevant to us locally. That being the collapse of the Green vote. How is that going to impact provincial politics? That's a big thing. There was a minority government in BC not too long ago with a Green party as holding up balance of power.
And what lessons do we learn? What lessons do we learn from what the Conservatives just went through, where they were I don't know, trying to be moderate to some and not so moderate to others, all under one umbrella?
Right.
And what message does that send to the BC Liberals provincially as well, where they've got so many Conservatives within that party? And I think it's been pointed out now that really we've begun to mirror the United States, where our cities are becoming what you would call, I guess in italics, progressive. A lot of New Democrats and a lot of Liberals in our cities. And once you get out of the cities, baby, it's conservative. And it's sort of what's happening with the red state, blue state. In Canada, we've got the urban elite, if you like, the urban intellectuals, the urban progressives. And then you move out into the rural areas and it's all blue, baby.
BB. Well, and there are demographic shifts going on that we'll be discussing today and ongoing. We like to think of ourselves as very young people, don't we? You and I, at least I do. I know, but there's an entire several generations before us that are not thinking the way that we are, that are very much in a different place, different values. How does that impact these parties? Can't wait to talk about this with our guest today, political strategist Brad Zubyk.
Yeah, Brad Zubyk has belonged to a number of different political movements over the years, both provincially, federally. He's working with some municipal elections right now. So Brad knows quite a bit about a lot of different political groups and how they've evolved or not evolved, as the case may be. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. And so once again, we have a minority government in Ottawa, and it's time that we really did something, even with this minority government. And we can't dig ourselves continually into massive debt. So what are we going to do about that? We better do something about it now. We can't just throw money off the back of a truck, regardless of the fact we have a government that has been doing that during the COVID pandemic. We have to build for the future. What's the plan? Also, what about our criminal justice system? All this crime in the street. Are we finally going to do something about reasonable facilities for the mentally ill, reasonable facilities for people with drug addictions? It's becoming so dangerous on our streets. We have to deal with that. And finally, what about the flags at half-mast all over the country? I believe it's time for reconciliation with our First Nations. Enough with the flags. Let's get rid of the Indian Act. Let's give our First Nations a chance to govern themselves and move in a positive direction. And in short, I think we all need to move in that positive direction together.
I'm telling you, Robin, I want to vote for you. I completely agree with all of those points. Economic development and consequences from COVID. A national housing strategy. Reconciliation with our First Nations people. criminal justice reform. Excellent.
Well, and of course, you know, this was supposed to be an election that was going to be about climate change.
Right.
And we decimated the Green Party in this election. Now, part of that may be that the Liberals already had a very strong agenda on climate change, and people turned to that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I don't know that this election was really much about anything other than Justin Trudeau thought when he called this election that he would be able to take credit for his great leadership during the COVID crisis. And what happened, of course, is that we got the variant coming through. Suddenly, there's tons of people in hospitals all across the country. There's huge marches from anti-mask people. It becomes this violent reaction. People are pent up. They've been stuck at home, all this angry reaction. And I think Trudeau should have blinked. He should have looked at this and said, maybe this isn't the time for an election. We have the variant coming through. This isn't a good time to call it. And yet I believe they got the momentum going. They got so many people organized. They got their signs. They got their campaign literature, and they thought, "Let's go. We can win this." And now we're back exactly where we started.
I can understand how folks get frustrated, Robin, and have been frustrated. And we saw that explode over the last 2 to 3 months. It's exploded in so many different ways, and one of them is civil disobedience.
Yes.
How can it now appear to be that we can do whatever the bleep we want to whomever we bleeping want to? Come on, where's civil society in all this? Protesters up in Fairy Creek, pouring stuff on police commissioners. Oh my, that would never have been conceived as appropriate anywhere, anytime, and now it's happening almost weekly. So,
or people marching into schools, anti-vaxxers marching into schools. I mean, we have a lot of civil disobedience happening simultaneously from different places at different times for different reasons. And a lot of it, as you say, John, is pent up frustration, I think, about the fact we've had to live under COVID for almost 2 years and people are tired of it.
So go to a bar, over drink for a week.
Use your passport to get in, though, John. You got to use your passport to get in. You know, and I mentioned the economic development thing. Well, we've got to get going on that. And it's creaking along. Like we've just now celebrated the fact that the Clipper finally is coming back to Victoria Harbor. Cruise ships aren't back yet. They haven't opened the border with the states where we can drive into the US yet. And you know, I hear that the cruise ships will be coming back here, irrespective of the fact that Senator Murkowski in Alaska is trying to repeal the Jones Act so that the ships don't have to stop in Victoria anymore. Next year, at least, the cruise ships are coming back, but they're only going to be at half capacity because of COVID. So we'll still be down in our numbers. We're a long ways from being back to being buoyant and economically stable.
I think what folks are feeling, I know what I'm feeling, I can sense it amongst the few folks I've talked to in the early hours post-election, is just some accountability to what you say and make sure you do it. In other words, if we're going to be moving on or having action on crime reform and on some of these out of control demonstrations, then let's see some solutions. On the economic front, you and I might disagree with others on how to move ahead, but can we at least have something to talk about? You know,
yeah, I mean,
housing strategy.
Improving the economy is not simply spending more money.
No, housing strategy.
More money we don't already have. All that's going to do is run up debt and ultimately run up expenses, because already we're seeing inflation going up. Highest inflation rate rise in 18 years has just recently happened.
That's right.
These are all warning signs. It's time to get planning, start figuring out what we're going to do for the future.
I have a real worry, Robin, that if these politicians federally, provincially, municipally don't start providing solutions, whether we agree with them or not, there will be more civil disobedience. There will be more what we used to call anarchy, calls to abolish the police. All of this stuff has got to stop, and we've got to have some solutions from minorities, from changing governments, from changing demographics, from collapsing parties. Come on, let's get on with it.
I got a very strong note from someone who's a not a fan at all of the Liberals, not really even a fan of the Tories. He's right wing to all of that, and he's blaming in many ways the media and saying the media is conspiring with big government to force these things through. And this is all around suspicion around the masks and even suspicion that COVID-19 is real and serious. And there are people out there that are going to feel that way irrespective of what we do. And I think we've pandered to them. And I think that the Tories federally just pandered to them, and it's cost them. And we'll see where that goes. But I think it's now time, Johnny, it's now time to get Brad Zubyk on the call, because we're going to talk about this federal election. And I first met Brad back in the early 1990s when Mike Harcourt and the provincial NDP swept to power. And he was then an economic and political advisor to Mr. Harcourt. He moved on and was actually instrumental in helping Justin Trudeau get organized for his rise in 2015 when the Liberals marched to power federally. He's gone on to work again with provincial governments and even municipal governments. So let's zoom him in. And now joining us in the Victoria Rumble Room is Brad Zubyk. Brad, great to see you.
Great to see you, Robin.
It's been a long time. I can't remember the last time we actually did any kind of a media thing together. It's I can't even think of how long ago it was.
You're one of the lucky ones, you know. The longer you can avoid me, generally the better you feel about it. So,
yeah. I guess it's been long enough that I'm really happy to see you. No, that's not true. That's not true. So, boy, looks like a big mistake made by the Liberals in calling this election, when I think they wanted to take some credit for their big campaign against COVID, but they did it as we had the variant starting to put a lot of people in hospital, and the public were very unhappy about having to go to the polls in the middle of this spike in numbers and in the middle of this big pandemic rise. And I watched Gerald Butts, who of course used to be Justin Trudeau's main political guy behind the scenes, and they were asking him on one of the TV networks, with this minority win, does this mean that Trudeau will be under pressure to leave? He wouldn't answer the question. Will you answer it?
I think they're going to all face some pressure. I think that goes for Singh, O'Toole, and I mean, they've all got a unique challenge, right? Trudeau is, by all indications, growing tired of the job a little bit. Isn't enamored with it. Added to that he took this big risk to get his majority and presumably hand it off in a low risk setting. That failed, so that's an issue. But I mean, he won't get forced out by his caucus. And then you've got Singh, who is personally liked but sort of can't break out of his TikTok hipster box. And then you've got you got Aaron O'Toole, who is probably the nicest guy in the bunch, but he can't, his challenge was getting more seats. I mean, it's a results-based business, right? So I think they all have challenges.
I'd like to build upon your comment. First of all, Brad, nice to meet you for the first time. Robin has said only fabulous things about you. Believe me.
Okay, sure.
I understand that you've worked very closely with federal Liberals and know Justin Trudeau personally and behind closed doors. Give us a little bit of an insight into really how do you think he's reacting today?
Yeah, I've met him in a political, I don't know about behind closed doors. I've certainly met him politically and on the campaign trail in my Liberal days. Mm-hmm. It's an interesting one because you mentioned Jerry. Robin mentioned Jerry Butts. And Jerry's very good at what he does, just as Justin is very good at, taking direction. We're in this era of perpetual campaigns. They're continual campaigns. The weakness of that crowd, to be honest, is governance. I mean, they campaign great. Like they have figured out this wedge. That's 2 elections in a row. They've won a comfortable minority with less votes than the second place party. And if you look at the map in Toronto, like Toronto, Montreal, and parts of Vancouver, they literally are covered in red, continual red. They elected, the gentleman that had to suspend his campaign as a sex criminal. He ran one-handedly in Toronto. So I mean, they know how to wedge and they know where their vote is, and they're very skilled at it. And Jerry's very skilled at that. They don't have a lot of policy depth right now. They have big ideas. They have a very limited ability to implement them, to have follow through, to have the systems of government. I'm not sure they care about it that much, to be honest.
Well, the thing I'm interested in a sense, is something that was talked about in the media after the election. A lot of analysis going on, not just on this show, Brad, but a lot of analysis going on, talking about in some ways how we're replicating increasingly what we see in the United States. We get this extreme right, these anti-vaxxers, anti-maskers, and people like Aaron O'Toole are trying to somehow keep them under the tent with the conservatives. I don't really know if you need them or want them, but he was trying to do that, which alienated places like Toronto, which went solidly liberal, because people there were horrified about that, and were horrified about O'Toole being soft on gun control. When you've got people shooting people in the Danforth and other parts of Toronto and our other big cities, people in urban centers are uncomfortable with that. So what we're getting liberal red and a lot of NDP orange, certainly in the West, in our cities. And in the rest of the provinces, in the rural areas of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, even Ontario, it's Tory blue. It's a little bit like the red state, blue state.
Yeah, sure it is, and that's a split essentially all through North America, is rural, urban, big city, small city. But I mean, the gun issue. Let's be honest here, and I don't even know which end of the gun to point. So I'll claim ignorance. But the fact is that we have a rise in gun crime, in gun murders, pretty much driven exclusively by illegal handguns coming over the border. Right? Canada seems incapable at times of having a mature conversation about a whole range of issues, right? And I think part of the problem is you have Mr. Trudeau, who is, and his team are so skilled at driving those wedges, in many cases, fake wedges, to exploit them politically, and power to them. They figured it out. The other parties haven't. But I mean, I'm not sure I'd reduce that. The PPC did O'Toole a favor, in my view. That's not the future, I can assure you. If you want to compare it to the US, you probably have more of a correlation between the way Justin Trudeau campaigns and Donald Trump campaigns, in a sense, in that they both play this extreme sort of wedge, almost cultish politics, right? Where, no sex offenders should be excluded from the landslide in Toronto if you're liberal, right? I mean, they play this very culty, very targeted, they scare the other side. So instead of draining the swamp, you're saying, look at that scary Aaron O'Toole, right? Yeah. But it's essentially a mirror image of one another, in my view.
Brad, I got two questions for you. Okay. Yeah. I got two questions. Let me provide a bit of context. So Elizabeth May, back with the Greens. No big surprise. However, regionally, the fundamental collapse of the Green vote is fascinating, and I'd like to hear your opinions on how that'll impact the provincial vote next time. That's question number one. Number two, you alluded to Maxime Bernier. He didn't win. Elizabeth May is back, as I just mentioned. Were there any surprises in this election for you?
I mean, there were surprises, because if you would have told me before that the Bloc improved their seat count in Quebec, if you would have told me before that the Conservatives improved their seat count in the Atlantic, I would have guessed a lot closer race. And yet the actual gains of the Liberals in Ontario and their holds in Vancouver was surprising. Basically saved the day for them. But I mean, if you would have, early in the night, I'm thinking, okay, the Liberals will probably win, but we're probably within 10, 15 seats of each other. And you're looking at the rise in the popular vote and everything else. And it just collapsed in Ontario. I mean, it just totally collapsed. So that surprised me.
Were you surprised at all, though, about what was going on with a lack of conversation about China? the two Michaels. I mean, we heard nothing but that before the election. And once the election was underway, it was all quiet about international relations, where we haven't really shone as a country for a while now. We've had problems with China. We had problems with India. We have certainly lots of problems with the United States in recent memory. Wasn't much discussion about that during the election. And what John and I have talked a lot about on this show is that there seems to be an absence of really strong dialogue about what we're going to do about all this crime in our streets. I mean, they've closed most of the mental health institutions. They've closed a lot of or they haven't even opened a lot of the institutions we'd like to see for drug rehabilitation. I realize some of this is provincial, but a lot of it is shared provincial federal responsibility. But that really wasn't on the table for this election either, was it?
No, I mean, there's a growing disconnect, I think, between how Canadians view themselves and how others view us outside of Canada. Foreign policy is a perfect example. Then we can go to the public safety issue. But in foreign policy, I mean, I think you can make a fairly compelling and persuasive argument that Canada's lost significant foreign leverage and prestige in the last 6 years. I mean, it's almost unquestionable. I mean, if you look at our performance in Afghanistan, if you look at our lack of peacekeeping now, we've basically left the field. You look at China and how there's a growing mistrust element to how our allies view us. I mean, these are serious issues that have, larger impacts. But, we're in we seem to be in this generation that I think Trump first captured of short attention spans and perpetual politics. And if you can demonize the other side, people are busy in their lives. Besides you, and it's a wonderful question, who engages in discussions on foreign policy, let alone the economy, let alone mental health, right? Like these, it's almost like there's two tribes and they sit there pointing fingers at each other and don't really talk about a lot.
That segues for me, Brad, into my question, and it's building on your comment about governance and these parties' seemingly lack of ability to move beyond an election mode. Okay, so some of that. So now we're going to expect some kind of solutions. People are going to expect something to actually be done. We're out of campaign mode. No more of it.
Yeah.
If that doesn't happen, we're going to see some frustrations that we've now seen over a couple months. I think were expressed in the PPC vote. What is your opinion on what will happen? What kind of emotional uprising we're going to have if this government doesn't start producing solutions to these problems?
Well, it's a great question. I think these things politics itself tends to be cyclical. So for every action, there's sort of a reaction. So, after the years of Trudeau Senior, you sort of had this movement that culminated, quite frankly, in the Chrétien Martin laser focus on cleaning up the financial mess, right? You saw it in Britain post-Labor with Margaret Thatcher. You saw it with Ronald Reagan. You see it. You see it. It's a continual flow where it goes like this, and it really depends on what point in the cycle you're on. Right now, I guess the question to me, John, is, are we at that point in the cycle where people notice? Because once the pain starts, once we get inflation, once we get higher interest rates, once we get continued economic slowdown, I mean, again, contraction in the second quarter this year of the GDP, they'll start to care. But when you're on this cycle, like, facts matter very little. We're the only country in the G7 to have emissions go up 6 straight years. We're the only country in the G7 to see economic growth go backwards in the second quarter. And we're the only country in the G7 to actually have record or 20-year record high of inflation. So you have all these neutral indicators, but we're in essence in a little bit of a fact-free world at the moment. And that's what's my comparison to Trump again. Like, the way Trudeau campaigns, and Lord knows he's skilled at it.
Mm.
I mean, they just basically push back and lie. I mean, that if you watch the campaign, there's multiple clips where somebody will raise inflation. That's not true. Or economic contraction. He'll just say we've had.
Or they
stunning-
deflect. Or they deflect.
Right. No, I mean, but it's out now BS half the time. But who does that remind you of? You know, and it's fine. I don't get overly fussed about it. It's politics in 2021, and it's cyclical, and this too shall shift. But when you ask if people are concerned about delivering, I don't think we're at that point in the cycle yet. I think he's had a lot of mulligans, and he'll get a lot more mulligans, and actions be damned.
Yes, yes, yes. My signature response. Great discussion with Brad. Lucky to have him on this day, post-election. And, you know, as we discussed earlier, now rubber hits the road. We're out of the election mode now, and we're going to see what's happening. I mean, now there's got to be some solutions. So anyway, we'll be talking about that for a long time. But what's
we're
coming up
going to
next?
focus. We're going to focus on other things. I mean, the show has never been designed to be just about politics, and certainly not just about the federal election. We're on to all sorts of other topics and areas that we find interesting, and hopefully our audience also finds interesting. And
they do. They do.
They do increasingly.
They do. Almost
We're thrilled about that.
55,000 of them have watched the show.
Yeah, it's great. We're starting to really appreciate people following us and following along as we try to figure this out ourselves, as we have been kind of experimenting as we go forward with this show, John. And I think we're finding a groove. And I really hope that people stick with us, because we're sure enjoying doing this. Yeah. You may recall, John, a couple of weeks ago, we had Sheila Orr on the show, the former MLA and city councilor.
Yeah, sure.
And Sheila had a lot of great points to make about how the things are going to fall with the federal election. And she's a staunch federal liberal, but wasn't enamored with Justin Trudeau. So I will be curious to hear what she thinks about that. However, what she was talking about during the show was who's going to run for council in Victoria next fall. And she was setting out a couple of names. She wants some strong women on council, and she wants some strong women that actually are going to be balancing things out on that council, where it's not just the voice of perhaps Stephen Andrew and occasionally Charlene Thornton-Joe and occasionally Jeff Young from a business perspective. Yeah. We need to balance this thing out. I think all voices need to be heard. It doesn't mean we shouldn't have people from the progressive movement on council, but they shouldn't only be people from that one vantage point.
Exactly.
So she was talking about somebody that she thought would be great, who's Ida Chong. She said, Ida Chong needs to be back in politics. We need her back on Victoria Council. And Sheila says, look, I'm not a close personal friend of Ida Chong, but I've admired her for a lot of years. She's very hardworking. She certainly knows the city. She's been on the sidelines. It'd be interesting to know if Ida Chong is even entertaining that idea.
Right.
I think it's actually a pretty good one. And the other name that Sheila put out that we hadn't really thought about ourselves was Janice Williams. And, Janice Williams is somebody that we didn't really know, other than we've read some of her Twitter feeds. And she's, I think, a very proactive person in the business community. She's been proactive from a certain political vantage point that we can cover with her in more detail, because she's going to be our guest next week, John. We're going to talk to Janice Williams about, we'll probably talk a bit about the federal election and the future of the progressive conservatives, or the Conservative Party as it is today, and as there's still a progressive element to it. We'll also talk, though, a lot about what's going on with the Beacon Hill Park dispute, which she's been very involved with. She even lives reasonably close to that, so she has a first-hand view of what's going on in that part of the city. We'll talk about other issues in Victoria, other issues with crime in our cities and what needs to be done. I know Janice has strong views on all those things. She's going to be a great guest. Really looking forward to having her on the show, John.
I'll be so honored to meet and chat with Janice. Sheila had lots of good things to say about her.
She did.
And I've since jumped onto her Twitter feed, and very opinionated person. I
We're
think
talking about
gonna
Janice
have-
Williams. Janice Williams Twitter feed.
Right,
Yeah,
Janice
yeah,
Williams is, right?
yeah, yeah.
And so really knows her stuff too. Very, very detailed, logical, objective commentary. Can't wait to see her. But just as I jumped on to see what she's talking about, I encourage all of our listeners.
And viewers.
Every week they keep getting
and,
larger.
and John, our viewers too. You know, people who are actually watching our show.
Exactly. And there's a lot of them, like I alluded to. We're near 55,000 cumulative views since we started not too long ago. We've got Twitter. We've got Facebook. We've got our websites. We've got YouTube. And we have TikTok, which is a really appealing platform for people to listen to what we're saying. And we get a ton of commentary there. So I really encourage you to share all these things, come on board, get some opinions you might not hear elsewhere. So what a great show we've had today. My name is John Jurisic, the never-ending, ongoing creation sensation.
I'm just looking at my watch. Yeah, okay, that was good. Yeah, never ending. I was wondering about that. And I'm John's partner in crime, Robin Adair. And up along.